Yahan apki dobara liki hui story high. Nay characters kasaf, powerful hook se shuru, or takriban 10-minute ki YouTube narration, kuliyetayar. Main opki daige tamam rules follow kai hain. First person, simple American English, koi forbidden symbols nahi, or emotional cinematic tone. The day my son left me a chore list and drove away. The morning my son treated me like hired help was the morning I finally remembered I was still a man with a life of my own. I found a folded piece of paper sitting on my kitchen counter, and by the time I finished reading it, my hands were shaking, not from anger, but from something quieter and much older. That single sheet of paper changed the direction of my entire life, and I did not see it coming. My name is Walter Grady, and I am 67 years old. I live alone in a small house outside Springfield, Missouri, in the same home where my wife Margaret and I raised our son Dean. Margaret passed away 5 years ago, and since then, I became the man everyone in the family quietly relied on without ever asking if I wanted the job. I watched the grandkids. I fixed leaking pipes. I showed up to every holiday early and left last. I never once said no, because saying yes felt like the only way to still matter to anyone. That particular morning started like any other. I walked out to check the mail, and when I came back inside, I noticed my son Dean and his wife Renee were already gone. They had let themselves into my house using the spare key I had given them years earlier for emergencies. On my counter sat a folded note with 12 items written on it in Renee's neat handwriting. Feed the dog twice a day. Do not let him on the furniture. Water the tomatoes on Tuesday and Friday. Call if anything leaks. At the very bottom, in smaller letters, it said, "We will be back in 10 days. Thanks, Dad." There was no question mark anywhere on that page. I stood there in my own kitchen holding that piece of paper, and something inside me went very still. There was no phone call before they left. No conversation asking if I had plans of my own that week. Just an assumption, written down neatly, that my time belonged to whoever needed it most. I thought back to a conversation I had with Dean 2 months earlier, when I told him I had always wanted to drive the Pacific Coast Highway, the trip Margaret and I never got to take together. He had nodded at the time, the way people nod when their mind is already somewhere else. I sat down at the kitchen table by the window, the same spot where Margaret used to read every morning with her coffee. Her reading glasses were still folded on top of the book she never finished, exactly where she left them 5 years ago. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not rage. It was something heavier, the kind of ache that comes from realizing you have become useful to people who stopped seeing you as a person a long time ago. That night, I could not sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the open road, about Margaret laughing beside me in the truck decades earlier, about the fact that I was in good health, had a paid-off truck sitting in the driveway, and apparently nothing better to do than water someone else's tomatoes for 10 days. By 4 in the morning, I had made my decision. I did not call Dean. I did not leave a note explaining myself. I fed my neighbor Hal's cat one last time, handed him a spare key, packed one bag, my good jacket, and Margaret's old road atlas, the one with half the pages folded down marking every place she had dreamed of seeing. Then I got in my truck and drove west. The first day took me through flat land under an enormous open sky, and something about not knowing what the next hour would bring felt like freedom I had forgotten existed. I stopped at a small diner where the coffee was weak and the pie was excellent, and I ate slowly for the first time in years. Somewhere near the New Mexico border, my phone buzzed with a call from Dean. I looked at the screen, set it down, and kept driving west toward the coast. That night, I called my grandson Tyler from a motel outside Albuquerque. He answered half asleep and confused, and when I told him I was on a road trip alone, he asked if his father knew. I explained that his father had left me a chore list and driven off without so much as a real conversation, so I had decided I had plans of my own. Tyler laughed, and then his voice turned serious, asking if I was okay. I told him I was better than I had been in years. He offered to cover for me, but I told him not to bother, that his parents would figure it out eventually. Arizona surprised me with cool pine forests and skies so blue they looked painted. I sat alone at a picnic table and let myself think about all the small things I had swallowed over the years without ever saying out loud. The birthday Dean forgot entirely. The time Renee redecorated my guest room without asking, because she decided it needed updating. The holidays I cooked for 8 people and nobody lifted a finger until the dishes were already piling up. None of it was cruel on its own. That is the strange thing about becoming invisible. It never happens all at once. It happens the way a room slowly fills with clutter, one small dismissal at a time, until one day you cannot find yourself in it anymore. When I crossed into California and finally saw the ocean along the coast road, something in me broke open quietly. I had not cried when Margaret died. I cried standing on a cliff in California, looking at water she never got to see with her own eyes. At a small roadside cafe, I met a retired Navy man named Marcus, 72 years old, and still figuring out what to do with himself after losing his wife 8 years earlier. He said something that stayed with me the rest of that trip. The trouble with being reliable is that people stop asking if you are willing. We drove part of the coast together after that, two old men who finally understood each other without needing to explain much. By the time I reached Big Sur, I had turned my phone back on to find 14 missed calls and a text from Tyler saying his parents had noticed I was gone, but that he had not told them exactly where. I listened to one voicemail from Dean, his voice tight and careful, asking what he should tell the kids. He never once asked if I was okay. He only asked what he should say to explain me away. That told me everything I needed to know about how far things had drifted. Standing at Big Sur with Marcus beside me, I opened Margaret's atlas to the next folded page, and beside it, in her handwriting, were two words that never should have had to sit together. Finally someday. I stood there a long while, letting that sink in. That evening, my daughter-in-law Renee called, and for the first time her voice carried real worry instead of frustration. When she admitted the chore list had been the wrong way to ask for help, I told her plainly that I had cooked more meals in her house than she had, fixed her gutters, watched her children, and never once received 10 minutes of real conversation in return. She did not argue. She simply said, "I know." That night, I recorded a voice message for Dean instead of typing one out. I told him I was fine, that I was finally driving the coast his mother had always dreamed of seeing, and that this was not punishment or some kind of breakdown. I told him the chore list was only the latest version of something that had been building for years, that I loved him and had always been proud of him even when I forgot to say it, but that I was a person and not a fixture in his house. I told him I would come home, but not to the same arrangement, and that I hoped he would think seriously about what that meant. Dean called me back 3 days later, somewhere around the Nevada border. His voice was slow and careful the way it always was with hard things. He admitted he had no excuse, and then he said something that landed harder than he probably intended. He said his mother would have told him the truth about this a long time ago. He was right. Margaret always knew how to say the hard thing with enough warmth that it felt like a gift instead of an accusation. I told him I was coming home, but that things had to change. When he asked what different looked like, I told him plainly, "Ask me things. Ask if I am free. Ask what I want. Treat my time like it actually belongs to me, because it does." I pulled into my own driveway 3 weeks, and 4,000 miles later, road dust covering the truck, the tomatoes somehow still alive thanks to Hal. That evening Tyler showed up unannounced, studied my face for a long moment, and told me I looked different, less apologetic. He handed me a pencil drawing he had made, a truck on an empty highway with mountains behind it, and underneath he had written, "He left to find himself. He came back to change everything." I set that drawing on the windowsill beside Margaret's glasses, where it still sits today. 2 days later, Dean came by and sat across from me at the same kitchen table, visibly uncomfortable, and I let that discomfort sit there without rushing to fix it for him. Eventually, he admitted he had been treating me like a resource instead of a person, and I told him that was exactly the right sentence to start with. Before he left, he looked through the screen door into the kitchen and said his mother would have liked the road trip, the first time in 5 years he had spoken about her directly instead of around her. I told him I knew she would have loved every mile of it. That night on the back porch, I opened my notebook and wrote down what I finally understood. Disappearing quietly is not the same thing as being gone. A person's patience is not unlimited just because it has not run out yet. The people who love you can still fail to see you, and those two truths are not a contradiction. You do not need permission to reclaim a life that was always yours to begin with. I added one final line beneath the rest. She waited her whole life to see the Pacific, and I finally saw it for both of us, and the water was exactly the color she always said it would be. Some mornings now, I still get up early and drive with no destination in mind, just to feel that same freedom on the open road. Tyler already made a list of every national park he wants us to see together before he leaves for college in the spring. I told him to bring a notebook of his own. He said he already planned to.